Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our first Global Nexus Conversations for the year 2023. We're really excited to continue this initiative that we started last year, really as a mechanism to bring people together to just have broad discussions around a number of different topics that are relevant to the mission of the Nexus at McMaster. Really happy to have lots of engagement from outside the university as well. That's one of the main missions of our group, and that is to make sure that we foster partnerships across sectors and across institutions. And really, what we're going to talk about today in our group of panelists today really exemplify that, I think, in an amazing way. And I could not be more delighted to start the year off in this fashion. So our Global Nexus conversation today is entitled "Learning from the Past to Look Forward, Preparing for the Next Infectious Disease Outbreak." And I think that's a pretty broad conversation area to have, and so I expect we'll get a lot of interest, especially that now that this is the ironically the anniversary of the convoy and starting in Ottawa. So lots of important conversations need to be had going forward. So we'll just want to begin. So for those of you who don't know who I am, I apologize. I should have said that first. My name is Gerry Wright. I am the executive director of the Global Nexus initiative at McMaster University. I'm a biomedical researcher with a lot of experience and interest in infectious diseases, but in particular in antibiotics and antibiotic resistance, and really delighted to be part of the Nexus team to really move the infectious diseases agenda from biomedical to the research and clinical research, but really well outside that to community, society as a whole, and really thinking about the impacts of these threats have on the entire population. So I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement and take this opportunity to recognize that McMaster is currently on the traditional territory shared by the Haudenosaunee Confederation in the Anishinaabe Nations, which was acknowledged with the dish with one spoon wampum belt. And that wampum uses the symbolism of a dish to represent the territory and the one spoon to represent that the peoples on this territory are to share the resources of the land and only take what is needed. So it's important for us to reflect on that and to really put it into continue with the spirit of it. All right. So what we'll do first is welcome all of our panelists. I want to make sure I do justice to their biographies. So on my screen to the left is Dr. Amy Greer. Dr. Greer holds a Canada Research Chair in Population Disease Modeling and is Associate Professor and Director of the Graduate Program in the Department of Population Medicine at the University of Guelph. Dr. Greer's research program explores the introduction, the spread, the dynamics, and the control of infectious diseases in populations. And she's a scholar practitioner who orients her research investigations to practical application, working at the interface of research, public, and veterinary health practice and education. To my right is Dr. Stephen Hoffman, who's now the vice president of the Corporate Data and Surveillance branch of the Public Health Agency of Canada. I guess a new role for you, Stephen, and after a long history of service to the scientific community in Canada. In this role, Dr. Hoffman is leading the modernization of the Canadian public health data architecture, surveillance systems, and risk assessment capabilities in anticipation of future public health needs, really relevant, of course, to this conversation. The Corporate Data and Surveillance branch is a coordinated group of centers of expertise in the area of public health surveillance, knowledge translation and mobilization, behavioral science, risk assessment, and data management. It's quite an agenda. And the center guides the agency's use of data and evidence to detect early threats early, understand public health behaviors, and act to protect and promote the health of people living in Canada. So in addition to that, Dr. Hoffman is also a distinguished chair in global governance and legal epidemiology and professor of global public health law and political science at York University, and the director of the Global Strategy Lab and director of WHO Collaborating Center on Global Governance for Antimicrobial Research. So somehow he's found time out of his schedule to fit us in. So thank you, Stephen, for being here. And last but not least is Dr. Ayanna Perkins. So Ayanna is a medical doctor. She's a mother of three, an epidemiologist, a graduate student of history at McMaster, quite a variety here. She worked in the Jamaica's public health system for almost 15 years, and 7 of those as a national medical epidemiologist before joining the United Nations Migration Agency, the International Organization for Migration, in 2021 as a project manager. So in addition to her medical degree, Ayanna has a master's degree in epidemiology and health management, and her primary interest is in outbreaks and contexts in which they occur. She's also a self-confessed fabric snob, so we might want to delve in on that at some point. But really an impressive background here of folks who are going to lead us through this conversation today. So our first question that we asked the panelists to think about, and is what are the considerations that are absolutely necessary when we're thinking about pandemic planning and response? So we've just lived through 2 years of what happens when the planning is not necessarily as organized as we had liked. So what do we do next? And so maybe I'll ask Dr. Greer to start us off with some opening comments. So thank you, Dr. Greer.
Sure thing. So thank you for the invitation. And I think I'm going to start my comments by just really focusing on what I think are 4 key points that I would like to make. So the first is that we need to consider emerging infectious diseases, which are predominantly zoonotic in nature. And so when we think about pandemics, these typically originate from pathogens that originate in animals and then spill over into humans. And it's really impossible for us to think about pandemic preparedness and response without really thinking critically about those upstream emergence events and that part of our pandemic response. So, when we have these spillovers happen, they tend to be kind of these single initial events where we have this cross-species transmission. And luckily, they're very rare events because the biology around it is really complex. So you need to have all of the right things in the right place at the right time, under the right conditions for the event to be successful. But events and behaviors that contribute to spillover are things like climate change. And we can't really compartmentalize our preparedness and response as neatly, as we might like in terms of, the health response. We have to really think about ecosystems more broadly from a planning perspective in terms of the biology of these complex situations. And so that disease spillover at the animal and human and environment interface is really critical for us to think about in terms of pandemic preparedness. I think the second consideration is something that our team has thought a lot about during the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, which is that we often don't have social scientists sitting at pandemic decision-making tables. And I think it's an oversight. I think we really need to work to better incorporate social sciences into pandemic planning and response. We've seen with COVID, very long periods of time where we have relied predominantly on non-pharmaceutical interventions. And that really requires careful consideration of communication and behavior change. And I don't think we've really leveraged the skills of the people who work in this area in a way that can help us to improve our response. And I think we also have, in my work, much of the work I do is really related to data. We use a lot of data in the sort of work that we do. We collect our own data. We rely on data from others. And we still have a little bit of a data vacuum. Certainly data availability and rapid accessibility of research findings has improved greatly since H1N1 in 2009. But I do think we still could improve the workflow around data sharing, especially in the early days. And the last comment I have is really that I think we also have room for improvement around public health communication and decision-making. You know, in Canada, we tend to have these large post-mortems after large public health emergencies. And, you know, we are going to have a post-mortem of SARS-CoV-2, and there will be recommendations made. And I expect that some of them will be recommendations which are very similar to those that were made in the original SARS report. And one of the things that I've really been thinking a lot about is about pre-mortems, which are tools that are used in decision-making in a lot of other sectors. And we haven't really traditionally used them in public health. But if you go to areas like technology or global security environments, the idea of a pre-mortem is something that is actually very commonly used. We want to think about decisions and identify all of the reasons why they might fail and figure out how we could mitigate some of those failures. And so it helps us to kind of uncover conditions for success. And so I think, you know, we want to be optimistic about pandemic response decisions without letting kind of our optimism bias overshadow the possible realities. And so, you know, I think we need to be comfortable with imagining all the ways that some of the decisions we make could go wrong so that we can make better decisions and communicate those decisions to the public in a more transparent way. So those are kind of my 4 key points that I thought we would start with.
Yeah, that's an outstanding way to begin, Amy. And so thanks for that. And I think that the data elements, I think, probably resonate well with Stephen's new portfolio. So maybe I'll ask Stephen to pick up and then offer his opening remarks.
Great, yeah, happy to do so. First, Gerry, a big thanks to you, to the Global Nexus Initiative, McMaster, for bringing forums like this together. It's really important to have these conversations and make sure that everyone can be involved. So a big honor to be part of it today. I loved, Amy, everything that you said. That was a great way to open the session, and particularly as a social scientist, I love the shout out to a group of scholars who have a lot to contribute, but often are not necessarily there around those tables, as you very eloquently said. My main point is that the key for preparing for a pandemic and responding to one is recognizing that there's going to be more of them. And I think one thing that's clear is that the COVID-19 pandemic was, of course, an extraordinary event in all of our lives. It was a pretty terrible event by all accounts. It was not equally terrible. It was disproportionately terrible for communities that were already facing greater conditions of marginalization. But the key then is recognizing that these kind of threats are going to be there in the future, if not in greater frequency, given the underlying risk factors that lead to events like a pandemic are only getting greater, such as population, such as urbanization, such as proximity between humans and animals and such, global travel, global trade. That's, I think, the recognition of this is part of our future is essential. Once we do that, then I think we need to be then on the lookout for threats that can emerge. We need to have better systems to detect these threats before they become big problems. Detection in this context means that public health surveillance, which has a long and storied history and great success, needs to widen its lens in at least a couple of ways. First, and Amy said it so well, recognizing that at least in recent history, most infectious threats of pandemic potential have originated in animals, meaning that we need to take a One Health approach to our public health surveillance, recognizing that human health is interdependent with animal health, with environmental health. And second, we need to take a global perspective. The reality is that only 0.48% of the world resides in Canada, which then means even if we're narrowly focusing on the health of one country, like for example, the health of people in Canada, which is the mandate of the Public Health Agency of Canada, where I now work, it's clear that then 99.52% of public health threats are likely to start outside of Canada. As a result, agencies like the one I work at need to then take that global lens to make sure that we're trying to detect these things happening wherever they're happening, to address them where they are, but also to prepare if needed. The second thing on that continuum, though, is after detection is about understanding. And this is just recognizing that there's a lot of noise in this space. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean that it's a challenge to figure out what's a real signal of something to come versus what's something that's likely not to require a response. And so there are around 200 events every year that have pandemic potential. We cannot be mounting a pandemic response 200 times a year. So I think that highlights that we need to better understand and develop new methods, scientific methods, to better understand once we have detected a signal of some kind, is it one that requires a public health action? Because it's really once every 3 years in the last sort of couple decades where there's been a pandemic of global, or a public health emergency of international concern that has needed that kind of response. So 1 in every 600 potential events. And then maybe it's 10 out of every 200 that require a robust public health response of a smaller scale. So needing to better understand. And then finally, of course, ensuring that if we do have those tools to better understand which are the real threats to either people in Canada or people in other countries around the world, then it's about being able to prompt action. And to do that, it requires investment upfront, because otherwise when threats come, we're just playing catch up. Although of course there's a role for that, and certainly Government of Canada fully mobilized its financial levers to do everything it could to support Canadians during this pandemic. But even more important is investments in advance of these inevitable events, as well as, of course, ensuring that we're able, when we do want to act, we're able to act based on the best available research evidence, which means it's not just about producing the evidence, it's then about ensuring we have the evidence support systems that can be leveraged so that evidence can be mobilized during extraordinary periods of policymaking and decision-making, like what we see in a pandemic. Gerry, back to you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, those are some fantastic points, Stephen. So thanks for bringing that up. We'll follow up later. And I just want to note that to the audience that as you do have questions, please drop them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them as we move the program forward today. And so, Ayanna, lots of interest in your background now as a physician and a historian and public health expert. Maybe you can tell us, what you think about this opening question.
Thanks, Gerry, and thanks for the invitation to participate. When we spoke, I was very happy about the idea of the pandemic nexus, bringing together all of these disciplines. Just building on what everyone has said, Amy and Stephen, the widening of scope, I think, is really important. One of the considerations could be to think about what went right. So what has gone right in the past? And we could look back at previous pandemics, but we have to be cautious in doing so, because as you know, the context would have changed. The 1918 influenza pandemic has been used as the comparator for the COVID-19 pandemic, but a lot has changed since then. Things have also remained the same. We could consider what went right in 1918, and we can consider what has gone right so far in the COVID-19 pandemic. We could look at survival. So we've looked at deaths a lot. The latest figures from I checked yesterday from WHO, roughly 600 million people have been infected with COVID-19, and roughly 6 million people have died. So that means that 500 plus million people have survived. How did they survive? Why did they survive? In 1918, the estimates are that roughly 500 million people were infected, and the estimates of mortality range from 25 to 100 million who died. So if we take it at 50 million, the fact is very many people, as awful as it was, very many people survived. So what factors led to their survival? There's a lot of information now from various historians have been doing work looking at pandemics of the past, epidemics of the past, infectious diseases in the past, especially around the anniversary of the 1918 influenza pandemic. And I'm singling that pandemic out because it has most often been compared to what's happening with COVID-19. There were quite a few publications, including Catherine Arnold. She was looking at the perspective of the patient, the persons who actually had COVID-19, what it was like for them. So those are some potential sources in terms of looking at how things went for survivors. We have to be cautious, though, in making the comparisons, and many historians have been reluctant to comment on the comparing pandemics. It was David Arnold, I believe, in one article I read, he said, if you've seen one pandemic, you've seen one pandemic. So they're not the same. There's similarities, but there are also differences. We also need a certain amount of humility in the face of uncertainty. What we're looking for, I think, when we're comparing is certainty in terms of preparing to make sure that we don't have as much mortality, but we have to be comfortable with a certain amount of uncertainty. We need to consider the context in which, like I said, in which the previous pandemics have occurred. There have been changes, for example, social, economic, medical, in the science and medicine, how the theory and practice of medicine over the past 100 years. We at the time of the 1918 pandemic, for example, the miasma theory, the germ theory, was not fully accepted. Viruses, the viral cause of influenza had not yet been identified, so the approach would have been different from the medical perspective. The caution is very important. And we in terms of the social sciences, involving the social sciences, I think that's an excellent point. People of the past were operating under certain constraints. And when we say past, we're talking about the distant past, but we can also look at 2020, what was happening in 2019, what was happening in 2020. And when we're looking even further back, we have to look at how people ate, how people drank, what the economic situation was like, what the political situation was like, looking for similarities and also differences. And we have to look at how people made meaning of what was happening, because in spite of scientific discoveries, the absorption of scientific discovery by the medical, by health workers, by the medical field, as well as by the population, those are constrained by how people understand their world, their worldviews. So it's one thing that has become clear, though, in my research so far, is that the importance of information, how information is conveyed, who gets what information, when and from where. Trust is very important. And in preparing for the next pandemic, the matter of, we mentioned communication, building trust, and getting a feel for where people get information from and what sources are trusted, which I think is in the realm of the social scientists to some extent, but there may be other disciplines that may be involved, like anthropology, for example. So in summary, we can think about what went right at all levels, at the individual level, how individual bodies managed to survive, social, environmental factors, economic and political context. And we can be cautious in interpreting the information, knowing that the past was as complicated, well, not complicated, complex as the present. So there are considerations, there's data that will be missing, and we need to be comfortable with a certain amount of uncertainty. Yeah, over.
Yeah, those are great comments, and I'm wondering, with your thinking about the historical aspects of what can we learn from the past. I mean, it sort of resonates with what Amy was saying in terms of a pre-mortem, I think, about trying to understand where we're at. And I wonder if I could ask folks on the panel to pick up on that, and that is saying, like, what, going forward, what are the things that we would need to want to have in place? Ayanna, you mentioned the issues of trust. I mean, what does trust look like in the 21st century and in the time of communication silos and those kinds of things? I think those are kind of important questions that are part of it. It's, we can have all the wonderful biomedical interventions in the world that are incredibly successful and at the cutting edge of molecular research. But if, significant parts of the communities are mistrustful of them for all sorts of reasons, are there ways in a pre-mortem that we could think about priming our communities and and to your point, Stephen, Canada is just a very small part of the world. I mean, what are the kinds of things that we could do as members of this team of scholars or this community of scholars to address some of these issues? So there's, I guess, a look for Stephen, you're smiling, so I'm looking at me. So I'm going to let you go first.
Happy to chime in. So I reason I love this question is because, Gerry, you're giving me an opportunity to add on to, I think, Amy's really good point about the role that the diverse different disciplines can play in this space. Historically, we've been thinking of pandemics as a biological phenomenon, but of course, actually, the risks of having a pandemic and the human consequences are mostly socially determined. And so in that respect, we have massively sort of underinvested in research and our understanding around the social drivers of pandemics, understanding of human behavior during pandemics, our understanding of what many call non-pharmaceutical interventions. I'd call it social or a policy intervention, which means that when we face these challenges, whether it's a pandemic or Gerry, in context that you and I work more often within the context of antimicrobial resistance, for example, or in the context of anything, it means we're not leveraging the full range of insights that we can and need to respond. So, for example, I think it was very clear to folks in the social sciences that the vaccination hesitancy would be a challenge, particularly in the context of an age where it's difficult for many people to wade through what's fact, what's fiction, talk of alternative facts, and talking about an undermining of science, and not knowing who to trust. I mean, these are real things that everyone faces all the time. And in that kind of chaotic information environment, it's obvious that these are the kind of challenges that would be faced. One thing I am quite proud of is when the pandemic first started, at that time I was working as a scientific director at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, so the National Health Research Funding Agency in Canada. And one thing that we did was, from the very beginning, we mounted these rapid research granting calls where researchers across the country could apply. We, from the very beginning, said that half of the grants would be focused on the medical and clinical and biological response. The other half would be on the social response. And so we were the only country in the world that did that. Quite proud of that, that I got to be involved in that. But it's because of all the things that Amy highlighted, that Ayana highlighted, and that Gerry, that you mentioned.
Great. So Amy, Ayana, any additional comment?
Yeah, so I think when we think about what needs to be in place, one of the things that we learned post H1N1, so post H1N1, so in Canada, we have the Canadian Pandemic Influenza Plan. It says influenza in the name, but essentially it's, a plan for responding to a pandemic of a respiratory pathogen predominantly. And there were changes made to this, so we call it the CPIP. There were changes made to the CPIP post H1N1. And I think some of those changes included looking at a wider range of planning scenarios. So trying to be able to have a framework that could be adapted as we started to continue to gather more data early in the pandemic phase. And so I think that was an important step, but I think that SARS-CoV-2 again has highlighted the need to really think more broadly, even from where, I thought at the time that was a really great change that was made to the CPIP, but I think, you know, there were things that happened during SARS-CoV-2 that will help us to look at those planning scenarios and again, start to consider some of the behavioral and social science aspects that should also be incorporated. I think one of the other things, and I've said this to a lot of people, is that the plan just kind of ends, right? So like we have a plan and it's like, here's what we're going to do. I think de-escalation is actually far more difficult than the escalation part. You know, like the escalation part, we generally know what we need to do in terms of infection prevention and control and how we can reduce the burden of illness in the population. What becomes challenging is the situation we are in now, which is like, how do we de-escalate? How do we communicate the continuing risk and how people should kind of think about the risk as time evolves and how we de-escalate some of those intervention measures. And that's not something that we have traditionally included. You know, like the plan doesn't really talk about de-escalation at all. And especially after we've been doing this for, you know, 3+ years at this point, like we need to really have a frank conversation about what would the metrics be? How do we communicate information about de-escalation? And I think that's another gap.
Yeah, that's a really great point that I'd like to pick up on it. But I want to give Ayana an opportunity to respond to as well, bring her into the conversation.
Sure. In terms of broadening the scope, just to pick up on what Amy just said, the whole matter of de-escalation, like after the acute event, because for a pandemic is a disaster essentially, and it's a particular type of disaster, but it has things in common with other disasters. Sometimes after a disaster, well, determining when a disaster has actually ended can be tricky. And looking at what the impact, because the impact may not show up immediately, the pre-mortem can actually help to look at what the potential impacts after the acute phase has ended, maybe. But historically, for example, there in the 1918 pandemic, recently I read an article about what happened in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. And because of so not just the death, but because people were laid low at a time when planting was supposed to happen, then future harvests were affected and there was famine after. And of course, you had additional deaths from that. So de-escalation and planning for after and looking at what the potential after effects may be, I think is important. And in terms of broadening as well, the next pandemic may not be from a respiratory pathogen. It may be waterborne. It may be foodborne. It may be, I mean, HIV it took us a while to figure it out, but HIV was transmitted via body fluids and it became a pandemic. So in terms of broadening our scope, I think it's important that we also look at other potential pathogens and AMR, of course, antimicrobial resistance. With antimicrobial resistance, there's also the potential for bacterial and not just viral pathogens causing widespread disruption. Over.
No, those are excellent points. And I think while AMR is what is near and dear to my heart, and it's one of those things that it really is global in impact, but rarely seen to be threatening unless you're a victim of it. But is nevertheless pervasive and growing around the world. And I'd love to talk about that some more, but it's not my conversation to have today. But I do want to pick up on Amy, on what you said about de-escalation and the comments that Ayana brought up on it, and it gets to into the context of a question that was brought up in the Q&A component, and that is, are there learnings from the past in terms of de-escalation? Because I'm seeing this now. I'm sure we're all seeing this. There remain incredibly vulnerable elements of our population. I know personally colleagues who aren't able to mount an immune response, and despite having all the vaccines, and nevertheless are going to be remain vulnerable because they have other comorbidities. So those are elements of our population that exist, and nevertheless, we have this, frankly, a need to get on with life. And I'm interested to know whether or not anyone on the panel has perhaps some teachings from the past that enabled us with it. I mean, what Ayanna just said, is that at least in terms of sub-Saharan Africa and the 1918 flu, it was a hard landing with a lot of bumps down the road that have unintended consequences. I mean, is there anything for us to learn that can help us navigate the situation that we're in now, where we're still at risk, or at least portions of our population are still at risk, but we're nowhere near we were in March of 2020, right? In terms of danger to society as a whole.
I'd like to start that one off. So one of the things that one of the cautions in terms of looking at the past and learning from the past is how we learn from what we look at specifically. And one of the things that we could look at is the impact on health systems, or on the populations, what the impacts have actually been on populations, because we cannot see that now for COVID-19. We can, like Amy said, we can use our imaginations to try to project what it may be, but then we're drawing on the past as well, looking at what has happened before, and based on the current situation, what may happen then. And then the other question would be, people have been clamoring for some time for a return to normal. Should we return to normal in terms of the vulnerabilities that we have identified in our, not just our health systems, but generally in society, in populations? Should we return to normal? What should we keep? So I think in terms of de-escalation, it would be useful to consider what elements of to consciously consider, because there are remnants that we have from past pandemics, consciously look at what we desire to keep at different levels.
I'm happy to briefly build on Ayanna's point. During the pandemic, I was invited by the UN Deputy Secretary General to lead the development of a UN research roadmap for the COVID-19 recovery. And that effort was really around trying to think about, in the summer of 2020, noting that we were going through this extraordinary event. We didn't at the time know it was going to last until now and ongoing. But the thinking was, could we identify what were the top research needs to go forward and build back better? And I think that's the key with what Ayanna was saying there, that there's a lot that we don't want to go back to. So when thinking of de-escalating, yes, of course, things that are in play that are not things that we want to see, we have to figure out how to de-escalate appropriately. But there's many things that are not good about our planet. We're not living within ecological means. Climate change gets worse every year. We are leaving more and more people behind. Communities are facing even greater conditions of marginalization every year. And so as a result, we actually don't want to go back to the way things were. It's really about how do we use a life-transforming generational moment as a policy window to affect the kind of changes that people today want to see for future generations. And so it's a big, from that perspective, this is a little bit of it's a big opportunity for transformative change in society, jolted by a critical focusing event. And my only hope is we don't need an even bigger focusing event in order to motivate those kind of structural changes that will get us onto courses that will, for example, allow us to live within our planetary boundaries, allow us to achieve equity. So it's an opportunity, but only if we take it.
Amy, do you have comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, certainly we can learn about things from the past, but I also think we need to be thinking very proactively, and we need to be thinking about pandemic resiliency in terms of everything from the things that Stephen has outlined, but also in terms of our infrastructure, in terms of the way we engage in our work and those sorts of environments. During SARS-CoV-2, we recognized that, one of the highest risk kind of settings, right, are places where people are indoors for long periods of time at high density. And, this applies to respiratory pathogens predominantly, but, I do think, as we've seen with kind of the non-pharmaceutical individual level measures like prolonged masking and things like that, we can help to implement kind of softer touch interventions, if you will, if we think about pandemic resiliency around things like improving indoor air quality in indoor environments where people spend the vast majority of their time in their workplace, at their school, at their daycare, as a way to reduce risk of the spread of infectious pathogens. And there's really no downside to better indoor air quality through, engineering controls and HEPA. If you're asthmatic, if you have allergies, like all of those interventions that we've learned a lot about during the course of this pandemic, would help us to think about pandemic resiliency in those higher risk environments as we move out and de-escalate from SARS-CoV-2 to put us in a position that allows us to minimize risk kind of in the longer term, should we have another respiratory pathogen be kind of the next pandemic.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. In particular, I'm always struck by these interventions like masking, for example, that are common in other parts of the world. I'm thinking in parts of Asia, for example. It's not uncommon at all before the pandemic to see people take these preemptive preventions to help themselves and to help their neighbors, and yet we see this change here. I mean, you can imagine the same issues here. It should not take a lot of effort to think that it's a good idea to have good ventilation in schools, for example. And these are things that we could, the pre-mortem part of it is I think makes a lot of sense, and some learnings from the past. And I guess one of the things I'd like to pick up on what we're here, and I just want to remind the audience that if you have a question to please put it in the chat. We'll do our best to answer it. All of you brought up the importance of social sciences as part of the answer to this, and this is near and dear to my heart because it's at the core of the reason that we really built the Nexus initiative, is to really foster opportunities for biomedical researchers, clinicians, social sciences, historians, engineers, business folks to get together and make sure that we're all rowing in the same direction whenever possible. And I think one of the first challenges that I've found is that we all speak kind of different languages. And so one of the things I think that is important would be an important product of the current catastrophe that we're leading, and to your point, Stephen, is whether we'll take the opportunity to learn from it, is to train the next generation of scholars to have a broader feeling of a broader understanding of these other elements of society that tend not to be, like, there's very few opportunities for a biochemist, for example, to take a social sciences course or to understand a little bit about what's happening in communities or history. So what are your thoughts on training the next group of individuals? We tend to focus so much in universities on creating experts in a specific area, and I understand why, but it doesn't serve us well when you have these issues. So maybe just an open question for all of you, if you're interested to address. I'll pick on Stephen first.
Happy to go. I feel like my whole career has been around traversing different disciplinary spaces and trying to understand the language of different disciplines. Can't do it all. There's many disciplines out there, but within the ones that I work, I think that, for example, that's a really important question. I mean, of course, in science and social science, we've achieved so much advances by specializing, increasing specialization and enabling space and opportunity for people to really focus in and become experts on something very specific. We also need experts who can weave the things together and see the forest through the trees and see connections, because a whole lot of scientific advance, especially when thinking of paradigm shifts, are really about when ideas from one place, which initially might not have had application over here, someone connects the dots and sees, oh wow, that idea of evolution or punctuate evolution and equilibrium is actually also applicable not just in the human biology context or ecology, but also in examining policy processes and better understanding how government works and such. And so this kind of flow of ideas across disciplines is itself a potential specialization. I'm a little predisposed to this. I myself, my first degree was at McMaster in the health sciences program, an interdisciplinary program looking at health from many different perspectives. So maybe I'm biased in favor of that kind of thinking, but of course you need both. I would say though, our current academic structures have mostly privileged the specialization within a discipline. That's, for example, how most of our hiring of assistant professors, of new faculty members, is usually done in discipline-based departments, particularly I'd say in the social sciences, but not only. That is a big, big challenge, Gerry, to overcome in order to create space for those people who do want to specialize in that interdisciplinary or even transdisciplinary work.
Yeah, I mean, I would 100% agree with that. And I think, as I muse as I get older, that the university of the future must create that space for us to really have the impact that we want to have. Amy and Ayana, do you have any thoughts on training?
Well, like Stephen, I've been discipline hopping. Sometimes I wonder what people think when they look at my resume, but I agree with you, Gerry, that it's critically important to our survival. And it's not necessarily a new concept, because the universities of the past, of the ancient world, for example, there were disciplines, but the disciplines didn't look the way they do now. And that gives hope that if things could have been different in the past, then they can be different in the future. In terms of the actual disciplines themselves and how to train persons, for example, in medicine, I really do think in medicine, and at the very least in public health training, the history of public health is important. There's so many remnants of the past, as one professor said, they're echoes of the past in so much that we do. And much of the time, we're not aware of them. We're not aware of how the systems that we currently inhabit came to be. And sometimes looking back can help us to look forward. Like we can imagine better and it gives us hope sometimes that things have not always been the way they are now, so they can change. But change, if history also tells us anything, Stephen mentioned that he hopes that we will learn from what's going on now, so that it doesn't take a bigger hammer blow for us to learn. Change doesn't come easily. It doesn't matter if, even in science, even in medicine, things are discovered, new ways of doing things. I mean, look at the germ theory. Even John Snow, who is said to have been the discoverer of cholera being waterborne, that sort of thing, it was not immediately taken on. People continue to die. So the old ways die hard. I do have hope though, because looking at the past, things have not always been the way they are. I do think that we can begin in our health sciences to train persons in other disciplines, introduce social science courses, just courses that are done by trained social scientists. Behavioral science is important. I mean, it's important. I think history should be incorporated, and the persons who are trained and experienced in these disciplines should be the ones teaching these courses. And when it's done, especially at the undergrad level, then it gives persons a certain, I know I'm talking a lot, a certain perspective. One more thing, I'm TAing now for a course called The History of Magic. And I think it should be required for anyone who wants a career in the health sciences, who is going to be practicing, whether in mental health or medicine, etc. Because medicine and magic were so closely intertwined before, and it has such an impact on how we now practice things that we now consider to be so, just always have been the way they are. The way in which populations think, the way in which people really think and make meaning of their worlds. So I think we can start there. We already have existing courses that could simply be made a part of the curriculum for persons in training, especially at the undergrad level.
Now you see it, now you don't. So, Amy, do you have any thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have a panel of people who have, worked in quite interdisciplinary ways throughout their careers. So, I mean, you might get a different answer if you ask somebody different. But, as somebody who trained at a small liberal arts and science university, I see the value. I mean, I think there's value in specialization, but I think for undergraduate education, especially, there is value in having students experience different ideas from all of the different disciplines, whether that's in science or the social sciences or the humanities. I think that it's really, really important to have that and to have, to educate people who are going to be consumers of knowledge throughout their entire life and engaged in different types of learning as they go through their life. So I think it's really important. I think I'm not the sort of person who needs to be sold on the idea. And I think that's, and I think as Jana said, that's the way much undergraduate education used to be. And so, this idea of giving students the space to be able to explore their interests outside of their specialization, I think is really useful and important.
Yeah, you're probably right. I probably asked the wrong group of people. It's more of a head nodding as opposed to a debate, but that's okay. We're getting close to the hour, and I think what I'd like to just finish up on, and that is just something that Amy and Stephen in particular touched on, and that is the importance of the sources of, one of the things that we've learned from almost all of the challenges that we're facing, perhaps with the exception of diseases like tuberculosis that seem to have a human origin, although they must have come from somewhere, that a lot of these infectious challenges that we face today and will in the future have their origins in animals. So that's why the One Health view of the world is deemed to be so important. And I guess just in closing, because we only have a few minutes left, just trying to so we talked about bridging disciplines. It's even harder, I think, at least in my experience, to bridge sectors. The animal health sector, the agricultural sector, and in the human clinical sectors, environment as well. Again, a lot of you mentioned climate change and the impacts that's having. Any thoughts about how to do better in that field? Again, this is always seems a common theme seems to be coming out of this is a matter of communication and finding ways to cross disciplines. What can we learn from this? Maybe I'll start with you, Amy.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge, and I think that it's one that we're still kind of working on. I think collaboration between all of these different groups, really strong collaborations for this sort of work take time to build. You need to build trust amongst all of the different groups who are involved. And these are really, you know, like people have called them really wicked problems, right? They're problems that occur at the intersection of a lot of different big societal sorts of problems. And so you have to address the questions in an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary way. And those teams take time to really build. But I think it's happening. I do think it's happening. I think some of the challenges, you know, I think there remain challenges around how we do this work. You know, from a research perspective, historically, it has been very difficult to fund, for instance, research that really occurs at that intersection because it doesn't fit neatly into kind of that tri-council funding structure. And I think that's changing. And I think that that's a really good start to be able to form teams that can address some of these questions. So I think it's happening. I think it is slowly happening because it takes time to build the right teams, to build trust, to establish collaborative research programs that can start doing that. But I think it is happening.
Great. Ayanna, any last comments on thinking about either that or some other topic?
Well, I just want to build on what Amy said, and you had mentioned the One Health initiative. I do agree that it's happening, and like I said, health happens, not health, change happens slowly. There are initiatives. So I was actually involved in a One Health initiative talking to the animal health sector, and you mentioned the differences in language, and there are also differences in interests between the two groups, for example, human health and animal health. And there's human nature as well, where, you know, people tend to defend their turf, their way of doing things, and don't necessarily want to, at first, give or collaborate in the truest sense. I think having facilitators, people who are trained maybe in hostage negotiation, I don't know, to facilitate the collaboration between, it may be that these persons have the skills, the mediating skills, to facilitate these types of collaborations, because even though it takes time, we may not have time. Like we may not have time for it to happen naturally. So we could look at active mediation. And I agree that research funding, the people who hold the purse strings, I suppose one thing is to get to those persons so that the types of research that are funded are interdisciplinary, and intersectoral.
So maybe, Stephen, I'll give the last word to you with the last minute or so that's left with your hat with the Public Health Agency of Canada that I know has adopted a One Health approach.
Yes, yeah. Well, I'll just take 30 seconds because I know the time. And just to briefly say, I think this is, of course, a challenge. It's really about misaligned incentives and structures that have been created in order to pursue certain goals, but not others. For example, a Ministry of Health focused on human health, a Ministry of Agriculture and Agri-Food focused with different metrics, different bottom lines. Of course, though, we have ways of working through this. A lot of them are structural. A lot of them are readily available. Should governments, organizations, or citizens sort of decide that on that issue, we're going to prioritize taking a horizontal approach. So I think, Gerry, in some respects, this is about incentives, it's about structures, but it's also about mobilizing around those issues that we really feel that this is needed. Because of course it's needed everywhere, but governments, organizations, hospitals, schools are not all set up to do this on every issue. So we need to take advantage of these, because silos are, they're built for a purpose. They're to deliver and keep scope and focus. But on those certain areas, where do we need to cut across? And this, of course, is certainly one where we definitely do need it.
Great. Well, listen, we've covered a lot of ground this afternoon, and I want to thank the panelists so much for taking the time out of their busy schedules to do this. You know, the Nexus initiative really is seeking to do things differently on a big way, and this is all part of the opportunity to do so. And so I encourage you to stay tuned if you're not signed up to our newsletter to do so. I want to thank the panelists again so much for doing this for us. And the next one, next Global Nexus Conversations will happen on March 31st. And so stay tuned for that. Give us any feedback you have. And again, everyone have a wonderful weekend. And thanks again to our panelists for taking the time. I really appreciate it.